Catherine O'Hara was never the kind of celebrity who demanded attention. She built a career slowly, carefully, and with an unusual consistency that lasted decades. From comedy stages to television screens, she became someone audiences trusted. Someone who felt familiar, even when playing the most exaggerated characters. Then, quietly, everything stopped. In the early hours of January 30th, 2026, Catherine O'Hara passed away at the age of 71. Fans around the world were left stunned, not just by her death, but by how little was said afterward. What followed made the moment even more unsettling. People close to her began hinting that she had spoken in the days before she died. That later took on a different weight. Those words weren't meant to shock, but when they became known, they did. The woman she was beyond the roles, the circumstances surrounding her death, and finally, the message she shared before the end. Words that surprised everyone who heard them. Stay until the end, because that message changes how her final days are understood. Catherine O'Hara was born on March 4, 1954, in Toronto, Canada, the youngest of 6 children in a close-knit Irish-Canadian family. Long before she ever stepped into a studio or onto a stage, she grew up in a household where conversation mattered. Everyone talked. Everyone listened. Humor wasn't planned, it happened naturally, often in small moments. She wasn't raised with the idea that fame was a goal. Her parents emphasized independence and curiosity, not performance. Catherine learned early how to observe people, how to notice the small details that others missed. Those habits stayed with her for life. In school, she wasn't known as the loud or attention-seeking student. Instead, she had a quiet presence. When she spoke, it felt deliberate. Teachers later recalled that she had a strong sense of timing even then, an instinct for when to speak and when to stay silent. Toronto in the 1960s and 1970s was a city finding its creative confidence. Theater, comedy, and television were growing, and Catherine was drawn to performance not because of recognition, but because it allowed her to explore human behavior. She studied drama, but it was improvisation that truly connected with her. Improv taught her something important: how to trust instinct. There were no guarantees, no scripts to hide behind. You had to listen, respond, and stay present. That environment suited her. She didn't need to dominate a scene to make an impact. She understood how to build something collectively. Before she ever became a public figure, Catherine O'Hara had already developed the qualities that defined her entire career: restraint, intelligence, and an ability to find truth inside humor. Those qualities would carry her through every stage of her life, including the final one. By the time Catherine O'Hara began taking comedy seriously, she already understood something many performers learn much later: that humor works best when it feels natural, not forced. She didn't chase laughs. She waited for them. That patience became one of her defining strengths. Her real turning point came when she joined Toronto's improvisational comedy scene in the early 1970s. At that time, improv wasn't polished or mainstream. It was raw, unpredictable, and sometimes uncomfortable. Performers had to think fast, read people instantly, and accept failure as part of the process. Catherine thrived in that environment. She became part of the Second City Toronto, a training ground that demanded discipline disguised as spontaneity. Nothing about improv was careless. Every reaction mattered. Every pause mattered. Catherine learned how to let a moment breathe instead of rushing to fill silence. That control set her apart early. What made her stand out wasn't volume or exaggeration, it was precision. She could shift a scene with a look, a small change in tone, or a single unexpected line. Fellow performers often said she had an unusual awareness of rhythm, almost musical in the way she delivered dialogue. During these years, she also learned collaboration. Comedy wasn't about winning attention, it was about supporting the scene. Catherine became known as someone who elevated others. She listened carefully, adjusted instinctively, and never tried to overpower a moment just to be noticed. This period also shaped her confidence in a quiet way. She didn't develop confidence through praise or applause alone. She built it through repetition, night after night, scene after scene, learning what worked, what didn't, and why. Mistakes weren't embarrassing to her, they were information. By the late 1970s, her reputation had grown beyond Toronto. Producers and writers noticed that she could handle complex characters without turning them into caricatures. Even when a role was exaggerated, she grounded it in recognizable behavior. Comedy, for Catherine O'Hara, was never about being funny at all costs. It was about honesty, finding humor inside real emotions, awkwardness, insecurity, and contradiction. That philosophy would follow her into television and film, shaping a career that lasted far longer than anyone expected. By the time larger opportunities arrived, she wasn't searching for identity or approval. She already knew who she was as a performer. And that clarity made the next stage of her life possible. Catherine O'Hara's transition from live comedy to television didn't feel sudden to her, even though it looked that way from the outside. By the time cameras entered her world, she had already spent years refining her instincts in front of live audiences. Television simply became another space to apply the same discipline. Her earliest television work placed her in ensembles rather than spotlight roles, which suited her perfectly. She understood how to support a scene without pulling focus unnecessarily. Writers appreciated her ability to take loosely defined characters and give them shape, intention, and personality without over-explaining them. When she joined Second City Television, it marked a major turning point. The show wasn't just comedy, it was character-driven satire, and it demanded versatility. Catherine played multiple roles, often transforming herself so completely that viewers didn't immediately recognize it was the same performer. She had a rare ability to make exaggerated characters feel human. Even when playing someone ridiculous or overly dramatic, there was always a recognizable emotional core. That quality earned her respect not just from audiences, but from fellow performers who understood how difficult that balance was to maintain. Television exposure brought recognition, but it didn't change her approach. She didn't chase leading roles or try to reshape herself into something more marketable. Instead, she focused on consistency. Each role became an opportunity to refine her craft rather than redefine her image. By the early 1980s, Catherine O'Hara had become a familiar face to television audiences, known for her reliability, timing, and emotional intelligence. She wasn't being talked about as a star yet, but she was being talked about as someone you wanted in your project. Film offered Catherine O'Hara a different challenge. Unlike television, where characters could evolve over time, movies required immediate clarity. There was less room to adjust, fewer chances to refine. She adapted quickly. Her film roles often placed her alongside larger personalities, but she never disappeared beside them. Instead, she found space in subtlety. Directors trusted her because she didn't need direction for every moment. She understood pacing, emotional beats, and when restraint was more effective than emphasis. As her filmography grew, she developed a reputation for dependability. She arrived prepared. She respected the process. She didn't bring ego onto set. That professionalism made her someone studios repeatedly called back. What audiences responded to most was her authenticity. She didn't play characters that felt manufactured. Whether the role was comedic or emotional, there was always an underlying realism. Viewers recognized people they knew in her performances: parents, co-workers, neighbors, and friends. Even as her career expanded internationally, Catherine remained selective. She didn't measure success by box office numbers or billing position. She measured it by whether the work felt honest. That mindset protected her from burnout and allowed her career to stretch across decades without losing relevance. By the time she reached the height of her film success, Catherine O'Hara wasn't chasing momentum. She had built something more durable, a career rooted in trust. Trust from directors, trust from audiences, and trust in her own instincts. While Catherine O'Hara spent much of her life in the public eye, she was intentional about drawing a clear boundary between her work and her private world. Fame never became permission for access. What audiences saw on screen was only one part of her life, and she worked hard to keep it that way. She married Bo Welch in 1992, a partnership that quietly lasted more than 3 decades. Their relationship wasn't built around publicity or industry appearances. It was built around routine, mutual respect, and shared understanding of creative life. Both worked in entertainment, both understood long hours and public pressure, and neither felt the need to perform their marriage for anyone else. Together, they raised 2 sons. Catherine rarely spoke publicly about motherhood in detail, not because it wasn't important to her, but because she believed some things were better protected. Friends and colleagues often noted that when conversations turned to family, her tone changed. She became softer, more attentive, more grounded. She structured her career around that balance. She took breaks when needed. She declined projects that would pull her away for long stretches. Unlike many performers who felt pressure to stay constantly visible, Catherine trusted that her work would speak for itself. At home, she wasn't the character people expected. She wasn't performing. She didn't lean into her public image. Those close to her described her as practical, thoughtful, and quietly funny in a way that didn't demand a reaction. Humor existed, but it wasn't constant. It surfaced naturally, often in unexpected moments. This separation between public success and private stability became one of the reasons she aged so gracefully in the industry. She wasn't chasing relevance. She was living a life that felt complete outside of cameras. And that sense of wholeness carried into the later chapters of her career. As Catherine O'Hara entered the later stages of her career, something unusual happened. Her work didn't slow down or fade.
Instead, it evolved.
She began taking roles that reflected experience rather than ambition, depth rather than visibility. Audiences who had grown up watching her discovered her all over again. New generations met her not as a familiar supporting presence, but as a central figure capable of emotional complexity, restraint, and authority. She didn't reinvent herself by force. She allowed time to do the work. Her performances during this period were marked by confidence and ease. She no longer needed to prove anything. Scenes unfolded naturally around her. Small gestures carried weight. Silence became as effective as dialogue. Directors trusted her completely, often adjusting scenes simply to give her space. Public recognition followed, but it never changed her demeanor. Awards and praise were acknowledged politely, then set aside. She continued to show up the same way she always had, prepared, collaborative, and focused on the work rather than the response to it. Colleagues often said that working with Catherine felt grounding. She brought calm into high-pressure environments. She didn't rush scenes or chase moments. She trusted timing, instinct, and the intelligence of the audience. By this point, her legacy was no longer just about comedy. It was about longevity. About showing that a career could stretch across decades without losing integrity. About proving that you didn't have to reinvent your personality to remain relevant. As the years passed, Catherine O'Hara became more than a performer. She became a reference point, an example of how to move through an industry without being consumed by it. And that quiet strength would shape how people later understood her final days. As Catherine O'Hara moved into her late 60s and early 70s, she never framed aging as a problem to be solved. She didn't speak about it dramatically, and she didn't avoid it either. When the topic came up in interviews, her tone was practical and honest. Aging, to her, was simply part of continuing to live. She remained active professionally, but her pace changed in ways that felt intentional. She chose projects more carefully, spaced her work differently, and allowed herself rest without apology. To those watching closely, nothing seemed alarming, just a woman who understood her limits and respected them. Privately, like many people her age, she dealt with the normal physical changes that come with time. There were no public medical disclosures, no dramatic health announcements, and no attempts to explain herself to the world. Catherine believed strongly that not everything needed to be shared. Silence, in her view, didn't mean secrecy, it meant boundaries. Still, fans began to notice small changes. She appeared less frequently. Public appearances became rare. Interviews slowed. In an era where constant visibility is expected, absence quickly turns into speculation. Online discussions began forming narratives without facts, filling gaps with assumptions. What most people didn't see was that Catherine was still very much herself. She remained engaged with family, close friends, and creative conversations. She wasn't withdrawing from life, she was narrowing it to what mattered most. Those close to her described her as thoughtful, present, and emotionally steady during this time.
Aging didn't frighten her.
Losing perspective did. She often spoke about the importance of not letting fear dictate how you spend your remaining years. That mindset shaped her final stretch of the final weeks before Catherine O'Hara's death unfolded without public warning. There were no press releases, no visible countdown, no indication that anything irreversible was approaching. That lack of information is what made everything that followed so confusing. She cancelled engagements quietly. There were no explanations offered, and none requested by those who understood her boundaries. To the outside world, though, silence became unsettling. Fans accustomed to seeing her reappear periodically began asking questions. Then came the news. On January 30th, 2026, confirmation arrived that Catherine O'Hara had passed away at the age of 71. The announcement was brief. It did not include detailed medical explanations. It did not invite public analysis. And yet, within hours, speculation surged. People looked backward, re-examining old interviews, recent absences, and small moments that suddenly seemed significant. Ordinary words were reinterpreted. Neutral expressions were assigned emotional weight. The internet searched for meaning in hindsight. What intensified the reaction was the suggestion, shared quietly by those close to her, that Catherine had spoken in the days before her death. Not publicly. Not formally. Just a few words exchanged in private moments. Those words were never intended to circulate, but once hinted at, they captured attention. Fans didn't know what she said. They only knew that it mattered. The absence of details created space for imagination, but also for reflection. People realized how deeply her work had shaped them, often without them noticing. Her death didn't feel loud, it felt personal. Like losing someone who had always been there in the background. In the days just before her death, Catherine O'Hara wasn't surrounded by cameras, microphones, or public attention. There were no interviews scheduled, no statements prepared, no sense that she was trying to shape how she would be remembered. What she said happened in ordinary moments, conversations that didn't feel historic at the time. Those who were with her later described the atmosphere as calm. There was concern, of course, but not panic. She was aware of her condition changing, aware that time felt different, but she didn't frame it as an ending. She spoke the way she always had, direct, thoughtful, and without exaggeration. She talked about her life in practical terms. About how lucky she felt to have worked steadily without losing herself. About how strange it was that people often remembered characters more vividly than the person behind them. She wasn't bitter about that, just observant. She understood that her job had been to step aside and let the work take center stage. What surprised those listening was not sadness, but clarity. She spoke about letting go of unnecessary pressure. About how much energy people waste trying to control how they are seen. She mentioned that the older she got, the less interested she was in explaining herself to the world. There were moments of humor, even then. Small remarks, lightly delivered, that broke tension without dismissing reality. She didn't pretend everything was fine, but she didn't dramatize it either. That balance was very much her. At one point, according to those present, she spoke about time not as something lost, but as something used. She said that if she had one hope, it was that people would stop waiting for permission to live honestly.
Not louder. Not bigger. Just honestly. She didn't frame her words as advice. She wasn't lecturing. She was reflecting, thinking out loud, the way people do when they feel safe. What made those words powerful later wasn't their wording, but their tone. They didn't sound like goodbye. They sounded like truth. Only after her death did people begin to understand why those quiet thoughts stayed with everyone who heard them. And why, when shared later, they felt unexpected. After Catherine O'Hara passed away, the words she had spoken in those final days didn't surface immediately. They weren't written down. They weren't recorded. They lived only in memory, carried quietly by the people who heard them. And for a while, they stayed there. But as time passed, those close to her realized something. What Catherine said near the end wasn't important because it was her last message. It mattered because it sounded exactly like the way she had lived. Her words weren't about death. They weren't about fear or regret. They were about release. Letting go of the need to perform for approval. Letting go of pressure that no longer served a purpose. Letting go of the idea that life needs to look impressive from the outside to be meaningful on the inside. People were surprised by that. Many expected something heavier. Something emotional. Something dramatic. Instead, what they heard was calm clarity. Catherine didn't try to sum up her life. She didn't list achievements. She didn't seek reassurance that she mattered. She already knew. What shocked people later wasn't the content of her words, it was how ordinary they were. How accessible. How human. There was no distance between the person she was at the end and the person audiences had sensed all along. She spoke about being grateful not for fame, but for consistency. For the chance to work without losing dignity. For relationships that didn't depend on success. For laughter that wasn't forced. For privacy that was respected. In the days after her death, fans revisited her work with new understanding. Scenes that once felt purely funny now carried quiet depth. Lines delivered casually revealed restraint, intelligence, and empathy. People realized she had been sharing her values all along, just not in speeches. Catherine O'Hara's final message didn't change how people remembered her. It confirmed it. She lived without excess explanation. She left without spectacle. And in doing so, she reminded people that a meaningful life doesn't need a dramatic ending to be complete. Sometimes, the most powerful words are the ones spoken softly, only meant for those who were close enough to hear them.